are likely to succeed on the merits of their appeal and that the other stay factors weigh in their favor. We grant Trump's motion for a stay, tossing out the restraining order pending appeal. Now, pending appeal, the appeal, of course, means the appeal on the merits, the legal merits of the case, which really has to happen at the trial level too. That'll take months. It could take years to fully litigate. So the real question here on the ground has always been, during this period of months or years of litigation on the merits, during that period, will Trump be allowed to deploy the National Guard or not? The unelected black-robed tyrannical inferior district trial court judge Karin Immergut said not. During those months or years of appeal, I'm going to restrain Trump from deploying the National Guard. This Court of Appeals is saying, nope, we're not doing that. We're throwing out that restraining order. And during the months and years of argument on the merits, Trump will be allowed to deploy the National Guard. Of course, he's only calling out the National Guard for 60 days. 60 days. So it all becomes rather moot on the merits anyway. Is beyond judicial review. The unelected, black-robed, tyrannical, inferior district trial court judges literally have no power here. They have no authority at all. All right, factual background and procedural history: disturbances at the ICE facility in Portland. These are all things that Judge Karin Immergut said, well, not much is really happening. The facts on the ground are pretty minor, really. So I'm going to judge the facts myself. I'm going to make the same kind of commander-in-chief judgment call that the Constitution delegates exclusively to the Article 2 executive branch president. Me, as an unelected black-robed tyrannical inferior district trial court judge, I'm going to override the Article 2 executive branch president's judgment of the facts on the ground, whether they justify calling out the National Guard. And I'm going to decide that there's not that much violence or disruption or impeding or obstruction happening, and therefore calling out the National Guard was unjustified. That was the basis for the underlying TRO. This Court of Appeals now is going to step through page after page after page after page of the violence, destruction, obstruction, impeding that's been going on for weeks outside the Portland facility, to show just how feckless Judge Karin Immergut was in issuing her TRO. Really grounds for impeachment and removal from the bench. In the days and months, the Portland facility has been besieged, violently besieged. In the days and months leading up to Trump's federalization of the National Guard order here, immigration-related protests and events have occurred at several ICE facilities across the country. While many of these events are peaceful, others have been violent and even deadly. On September 24th, there was a shooting at an ICE facility in Dallas in which one detainee was killed and two others were seriously injured. So it's interesting, right? Because this Court of Appeals panel, they're addressing whether Trump can call out the National Guard in Portland, but they're also saying, hey, things the president has to consider are things that are happening outside Portland too. The trial judge here said, well, Trump talks about the assassin shooting in Dallas, but Dallas is not Portland, so that can't justify calling out the Guard in Portland. And I think what this majority here is going to say is that no, the president has to take a view of the whole nation, not just of each city in isolation. So that's why I find it interesting that they're referencing the shooting in Dallas here. On September 26th, over 200 protesters blocked access to an ICE facility in Chicago, also not in Portland. And one of the protesters was apprehended with a gun in his possession. Since June 25th, there have been regular protests at the Lindquist Federal Building at the ICE facility in Portland. Some of these protests have been peaceful, but many have turned violent, and protesters have threatened federal law enforcement officers and the building, federal personnel, and property. Again, Trump's not calling out the National Guard to enforce immigration law. He's calling out the National Guard to protect federal personnel and property, which is not a violation of posse comitatus. Now, calling out the National Guard to enforce the law, immigration law, for example, under the authority here, 12406. 12406 does not entitle the president to call out the National Guard for law enforcement. Posse comitatus is still in effect. The posse comitatus prohibition on using the military domestically for law enforcement, still in effect if you deploy the National Guard under 12406. But Trump's not calling out the National Guard to enforce the law under 12406, just to protect federal personnel and property. Now, if Trump does get to the point where he calls out the National Guard by invoking the Insurrection Act of 1792, the Insurrection Act does set aside posse comitatus. It allows Trump to do basically anything he wants with the National Guard, including law enforcement. And that should have the progressive fascists very worried. Based on its internal risk assessments, the Portland Police Bureau, so these would be the feckless local cops that are not helping the feds, activated crowd management incident commanders and rapid response teams on July 11th through the 25th, so 2 weeks. Even the local feckless cops, the progressive fascist governed cops, activated crisis management for 2 weeks, and then as a precautionary measure for basically another 2 weeks in June and July, and again on August 20th. So even the local feckless cops are seeing this as a crisis. They made 25 arrests at the ICE facility between June 11th and 19th. Indeed, as a result of the destruction caused by protesters and threats to the building, DHS was forced to close the facility for more than 3 weeks from June 13th to July 7th. Is closing the facility making the president unable to enforce federal laws with the regular forces, which is the trigger for activating the National Guard under 12406, Section 3? Of course. This significantly impeded operations, according to the feds, and it would, right? Closing the facility for 3 weeks would naturally impede operations. While the facility is again currently operational, the windows must be boarded up to prevent further damage to property or attempts at incursion and to provide security for the federal employees working inside. On June 8th, protesters placed wood, rocks, and a traffic barrier, apparently to impede operations. On June 11th, a man set fire to various materials protesters compiled to barricade a vehicle gate, and other protesters added to the pile of materials, increasing the flames. This would be arson, of course. Protesters then placed a pole against the main lobby entrance, so it couldn't be accessed, I suppose. On June 14th, a serious incident occurred when a group of protesters, including one carrying a firearm, advanced up the driveway of the ICE facility towards the main gate. They threw rocks and sticks at the guard shack and fired M80 fireworks at Federal Protective Service officers. Protesters threw a mortar at the front entrance of the building, injuring an officer. Had to extinguish 2 fires, more arson, and arson is a deadly force threat, friends. Officers were 2 fires in front of the building. Officers were forced to barricade themselves inside the building, and protesters placed chains on the exterior doors, so that's a fire hazard, obviously. Now you're trapped in the building. Eventually, the protesters attempted to breach the front door and broke the front door's glass. Federal officers were forced to deploy long guns, but did not use them. The protesters continued to throw mortars at the building. Remember, Judge Karin Immergut said not much was going on. That's why she enjoined Trump's calling out the National Guard. The Border Patrol tactical unit deployed an armored tactical vehicle to the building and, working with ICE SRT, pushed protesters back to the street. 3 protesters were arrested and charged with assaulting a federal officer. That is, of course, a multi-year, I believe it's an 8-year federal felony if you assault with contact. On June 24th, protesters attempted to set a U.S. flag on fire in the driveway of the ICE facility. Later, another protester attempted to light an incendiary device next to a guard shack. When officers approached the protesters, she threatened them with knives. Deadly force. Protesters also poured a substance believed to be motor oil in the vehicle entrance. So much for being green, so much for the environment. Although, in fairness, the oil came out of the ground. I don't really see any reason why it can't go back into the ground, but it's just dinosaur stuff, right? Also on June 24th, one protester shot officers with a paintball gun after an officer warned protesters to clear the building driveway, and another shined a laser in an officer's eyes. In my view, the laser in the eyes is deadly force. Force readily capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. A retinal damage blindness is a ready consequence of lasers to the eye. especially the quite powerful lasers that these protesters use. That same night, another protester was arrested for assaulting an officer with a machete and a knife. More deadly force. All three protesters were charged with assault on a federal officer. June 29th, an individual tampered with a building access card reader and was arrested after a foot pursuit. He resisted arrest by biting and kicking the officers, taking him into custody. 3 card readers were vandalized in June, with replacements expected to arrive in mid-October. So think about that. June, July, August, September, October. Takes 4 months to get a replacement card reader. With the readers inoperable, employees are delayed entering and exiting the building, and protesters take their photographs to dox the officers and their family members. Why would they dox them? Only, of course, because they mean them harm. For months, ICE officers have been the targets of doxing. On several occasions, protesters have followed officers who've been deployed back to their hotels, and groups have protested at the hotels. Several ICE officers at the Portland ERO office have had their names, photographs, and home addresses posted publicly in several municipal locations and residential neighborhoods, along with threatening messages. These are nice people, huh? Antifa. Multiple Portland ICE officers have had unknown individuals appear at their residences where their wives and children sleep and play. Appear at their residence in vehicles and on foot, peering into their homes and recording officers coming and going. On July 4th, ICE officers observed several individuals defacing ICE property with graffiti. When ICE attempted to apprehend them, one ran towards an officer and kicked him, causing him to fall, and another threw an incendiary device toward the officers, which then detonated near the officers. By the way, I don't know if this opinion will cover this, but I'll mention as an aside, Antifa pays their protesters to engage in violent resistance with federal officers because they're being video recorded by their own side. And then they turn around and they sue. They sue the government for damages, for injuries in civil suits. And if they can get a liberal, local attorney general, assistant attorney general, or district attorney, they get millions and millions of dollars paid out of the public coffers to Antifa for their supposed injuries due to supposed excessive force by the police officers. Antifa gets tens of millions of our dollars as funding through these fake lawsuits. The U.S. Attorney's Office charged 22 defendants between June 13th and July 8th, assaulting federal officers, arson, possession of destructive device, depredation of government property. Also in June, a man was arrested for pointing a laser at federal officers outside the ICE facility. Protesters regularly attempt to impede government vehicles as they enter and exit the vehicle. When a vehicle stops, protesters surround it, shouting threats to the arguments. That's assault. On August 9th, a group of protesters became aggressive when an ICE vehicle was leaving and began striking the vehicle with their fists. Federal Protective Service officers had to use pepper balls to push the protesters away from the vehicle. In September, ICE officers reported vehicles following them after they left ICE. September 1st, remember, the underlying judge here, the unelected black-robed tyrannical inferior, District Trial Court Judge Karin Immergut, who issued a restraining order against Trump calling out the National Guard, said not much was happening. Not much was happening. No need for the National Guard, in her opinion, and her opinion overrides that of the commander-in-chief. On September 1st, protesters assembled a guillotine outside the ICE facility. That's not threatening, is it? With 2 protesters wielding riot shields. Are riot shields a weapon? Yes, they are. This incident and others were also recorded in multiple emails from local police officers reporting their monitoring activities at the ICE facility from September 1st to 30th. So one of the things these feckless federal judges do is they say, well, you know, we've had all these reports from federal authorities about violence, but we choose to not believe the federal authorities. That's why this Court of Appeals panel is saying even the local cops, the Portland Police Department, have documented this violence. It's not just the federal authorities. On September 1st, the groups of protesters ranged from 40 to 200 people at different times of the day. That night, ICE agents made a push and deployed gas to clear the front of the building to move vehicles. September 2nd was uneventful, with around 20 of the usuals protesting. September 3rd, the next day, a person illegally flying a drone near the upper windows of the building was arrested and reacted violently. September 4th, the next day, a Portland police officer reported seeing several older, homeless people being coerced into approaching the ICE facility. That's another tactic of Antifa. They find deranged, drug-addicted homeless people and use them as human shields, to try to instigate ICE violence towards these poor, exploited homeless people. The instigators, that would be Antifa, told these poor homeless people that they should create a distraction or simply rattle the gate. Officers confirmed, this would be Portland police, that this was happening by watching the instigators escorting different older homeless people up to the gate. Federal Protective Services took custody of an elderly man after he asked if he could just come up to the gate and rattle it so the Antifa instigators would leave him and others alone. He was escorted behind the gates and interviewed. He told ICE agents that he and several other homeless people were being coerced to act to instigate an agent response, in other words, violence. They're making these elderly homeless people walk out into the minefield for them. Antifa is. So contemptible. Also, that same day, FPS arrested a woman described as a daily chronic problem who's very aggressive, believed to be armed with a Glock. She's made threats to ICE agents and has expended her 3 strikes at the facility. According to one local Portland officer, she has been arrested many times and can be very violent. On September 6th, there were 50 to 60 very active protesters, black blockers, that's Antifa in their all-black uniforms, agitators at the gate, lots of noise, flashing lights, swinging sticks. FPS was pushing out to allow vehicles to enter, and the local police observed 50 protesters in the driveway. FPS had only 26 officers on duty, so they're outnumbered 2 to 1. On September 5th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, I like the way the Court of Appeals is doing this. Local police officers reported groups of protesters from 7 to 30 people with low energy, some dressed in all black, that's Antifa foot soldiers, one with a baton, but no issues, according to local police. In the middle of that time period, September 9th, multiple individuals were observed on 4 occasions shining high-powered flashlights at vehicles departing the building to blind the drivers, obviously. In the second week of September, ICE received multiple reports that drivers leaving the ICE facility were blinded or disoriented after individuals shined high-powered lights at their vehicles. On September 9th, screenshots were captured of threats on social media to murder ICE officers. Feds ain't nothing but a target practice. Execute Gestapo on sight. Off the pigs. On September 12th, protesters photographed an unmarked government vehicle as it was leaving the ICE facility and then posted the photograph to social media and provided the location of the vehicle after it left the ICE facility. On September 12th, 8 to 10 protesters at ICE, but a vehicle arrived and unloaded a large quantity of sticks and bats, clearly a peaceful First Amendment protest, and it was unknown if they were gearing up for Sunday night or just to resupply. That's how coordinated they are, folks. The Antifa, violent protesters, agitators, have logistics. On September 13th, there were 40 to 50 people at the ICE facility. Someone had a green laser. The next day, September 14th, FPS increased the number of officers in anticipation of large numbers of protesters. They had not determined why the bats and sticks had been delivered. September 15th, 16th, 17th, there were groups ranging from 10 to 50 people, very energetic. September 18th, the next day, started with around 150 plus protesters. Later, 50 to 60 of the normal agitators, they screamed and threw objects at a local police car. Local police officers reported there does appear to be a large camp set up again, even though it was cleaned out earlier in the day. September 19th, PSI received a tip that someone planned to detonate a bomb at the ICE facility that day. Although the threatened attack did not occur, preparing for the possibility required an increase in security inspections and diverted important agency resources. Again, making the president unable to enforce the law with the regular forces. A local police officer summarized the situation by stating that the federal officers were busy. That night, 50 protesters throwing objects, running at cars. That's assault. Federal officers reported black blockers, this is the Antifa shock troops, assaulting people. And federal officers provided a video to local police of a black blocker assaulting a journalist with a large sword or stick. There was a disturbance outside the building that day, and federal officers deployed munitions to break up the crowd. On September 20th, there were protesters, 50, gathered at ICE, more agitated than most nights. September 20th, 22nd, I love how they do this, 20th, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, groups of protesters of 10 to 20 people, one disturbance involving a protester pepper spraying someone else, one black blocker, Antifa shock troops, in front of the ICE driveway. September 25th and 26th, 10 to 20 protesters, sometimes yelling at police. September 27th, 50 to 60 protesters outside the facility, blocking the driveway in anticipation of shift change, refusing to leave, many dressed in black bloc with helmets, masks, and other personal protection equipment. Federal officers requested assistance from local police to get the vehicles out of the garage for shift change. They had the resources to clear the driveway, but were concerned about protesters shining bright lights at them as they drove out. Local police did not assist because officers thought the request might conflict with their previous directions to not assist with facilitating the movement of vehicles in and out of the facility. Local police also did not have the resources to safely accomplish the task with a crowd of this size and demeanor. September 28th, after the announcement of the federalization order, there were 35 to 200 protesters. Local police attempted to de-escalate conflict several times, made 2 arrests. They did not provide traffic control resources, in part because of the confrontational nature of individuals at the ICE rally. There were a couple of confrontations when federal agents were facilitating vehicles entering or exiting. September 29th, federal officer had to deploy pepper spray fogger against a protester who refused to comply with orders to leave the federal property. Later that night, FPS warned protesters to clear the facility driveway and had to deploy pepper spray foggers again at protesters, shining high-powered strobe lights in the officers' faces, which is very disorienting if you've not had that done to you. One of the officers who had the strobe light directed at him experienced pain and disturbances in his vision. Normally, federal officers would be able to rely on local police to assist with large-scale law enforcement operations related to federal facilities in Portland. Federal officers have been informed by the local police, however, that they will only respond to life safety situations, not anything immigration related. But when federal officers called local police multiple times on September 9th to request assistance with a woman who was being physically assaulted by a group of 12 to 13 protesters, local police would not intervene or assist. This woman was, I believe, a right-wing journalist on the ground. And of course, the Portland police is controlled by the mayor of Portland, who's Antifa adjacent. Eventually, federal officers permitted the woman onto federal property for her safety and later pushed back protesters so she could escape from the protesters attempting to follow her. In June 2025, local police chief Bob Day spoke publicly about avoiding any actions that might show perceived or actual support for immigration agents, federal officers simply carrying out federal law. After local police had cleared a blockade of the ICE driveway to let an empty transport van exit. Local officers report that no officers are available to respond to disturbances at the ICE facility. The lack of support from local police has forced federal officers to rely almost exclusively on ICE and SRT federal resources for assistance in preventing violent protesters from attacking officers and the facilities in which they work. FPS deployed 115 officers from other regions working on a 24/7 basis to maintain order At the Lindquist Federal Building, FPS has thus far spent over $2 million on overtime pay and expenses since June to maintain order in the wake of these violent protests. In September, ICE detailed 3 SRT certified special agents to Portland. Detailing HSI SRT special agents to Portland diminishes their operational capabilities nationwide, which Judge Immergut said is not her problem. She's only addressing Portland. She doesn't care if President Trump has to vacate every federal officer from every other office in the nation. That's not her concern. I expect this majority of this Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals panel is going to say, no, the president has to take the whole nation into consideration in terms of being able or unable to enforce federal law with the regular forces. So that all comes into play, even though this suit is just about Portland.